From the Darkness Cometh the Light, or Struggles for Freedom, by Lucy Ann Delaney. Chapter 3. Mrs. Cox was always very severe and exacting with my mother, and one occasion, when something did not suit her, she turned on Mother like a fury and declared, "I am just tired out with the white airs you put on, and if you don't behave differently, I will make Mr. Cox sell you down the river at once." Although Mother turned gray with fear, she presented a bold front and retorted that she didn't care. She was tired of that place and didn't like to live there nohow. This so infuriated Mr. Cox that he cried, "How dare a Negro say what she liked or what she did not like?" And he would show her what he should do. So on the day following, he took my mother to an auction room on Main Street and sold her to the highest bidder for $550. Oh God, the pity of it! In the home of the brave and the land of the free, in the sight of the stars and stripes, that symbol of freedom, sold away from her child to satisfy the anger of a peevish mistress. My mother returned to the house to get her few belongings, and straining me to her breast, begged me to be a good girl, that she was going to run away and would buy me as soon as she could. With all the inborn faith of a child, I believed it most fondly, and when I heard that she had actually made her escape 3 weeks after, my heart gave an exultant throb and cried, "God is good." A large reward was offered. The bloodhounds, curse them and curse their masters, were set loose on her trail. In the daytime she hid in caves in the surrounding woods, and in the nighttime, guided by the wondrous North Star, that blessed lodestone of a slave people, my mother finally reached Chicago, where she was arrested by the Negro catchers. At this time, the fugitive slave law was in full operation, and it was against the law of the whole country to aid and protect an escaped slave. Not even a drink of water for the love of the master might be given, and those who dared to do it, and there were many such brave hearts, thank God, placed their lives in danger. The presence of bloodhounds and nigger catchers in their midst created great excitement and scandalized the community. Feeling ran high, and hundreds of people gathered together and declared that Mother should not be returned to slavery. But fearing that Mr. Cox would wreak his vengeance upon me, my mother finally gave herself up to her captors and returned to St. Louis. And so the mothers of Israel have been ever slain through their deepest affections. After my mother's return, she decided to sue for her freedom, and for that purpose employed a good lawyer. She had ample testimony to prove that she was kidnapped, and it was so fully verified that the jury decided that she was a free woman, and papers were made out accordingly. In the meantime, Miss Martha Berry had married Mr. Mitchell and taken me to live with her. I had never been taught to work, as playing with the babies had been my sole occupation. Therefore, when Mrs. Mitchell commanded me to do the weekly washing and ironing, I had no more idea how it was to be done than Mrs. Mitchell herself. But I made the effort to do what she required, and my failure would have been amusing had it not been so appalling. In those days, filtering was unknown, and the many ways of clearing water were to me an unsolved riddle. I never had to do it, so it never concerned me how the clothes were ever washed clean. As the Mississippi water was even muddier than now, the results of my washing can be better imagined than described. After soaking and boiling the clothes in its earthy depths for a couple of days in vain attempt to get them clean, and rinsing through several waters, I found the clothes were getting darker and darker until they nearly approximated my own color. In my despair, I frantically rushed to my mother and sobbed out my troubles on her kindly breast. So in the morning, before the white people had arisen, a friend of my mother came to the house and washed out the clothes. During all this time, Mrs. Mitchell was scolding vigorously, saying over and over again, "Lucy, you do not want to work. You are a lazy, good-for-nothing nigger." I was angry at being called a nigger and replied, "You don't know nothing yourself about it, and you expect a poor ignorant girl to know more than you do yourself? If you had any feeling, you would get somebody to teach me, and then I'd do well enough." She then gave me a wrapper to do up and told me if I ruined that as I did the other clothes, she would whip me severely. I answered, "You have no business to whip me. I don't belong to you." My mother had so often told me that she was a free woman and that I should not die a slave. I always had a feeling of independence, which would invariably crop out in these encounters with my mistress. And when I thus spoke saucily, I must confess she opened her eyes in angry amazement and cried, "You do belong to me, for my papa left you to me in his will when you were a baby, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself to talk so to one that you have been raised with. Now you take that wrapper, and if you don't do it up properly, I'll bring you up with a round turn." Without further comment, I took the wrapper, which was too handsome to trust to an inexperienced hand, like Mrs. Mitchell very well knew I was, and washed it with the same direful results as chronicled before. But I could not help it, as heaven is my witness. I was entirely and hopelessly ignorant. But of course my mistress would not believe it, and declared over and over again that I did it on purpose to provoke her and show my defiance of her wishes. In vain did I disclaim any such intentions. She was bound to carry out her threat of whipping me. I rebelled against such government and would not permit her to strike me. She used shovel, tongs, and broomstick in vain, as I disarmed her as fast as she picked up each weapon. Infuriated at her failure, my opposition, and determination not to be whipped, Mrs. Mitchell declared she would report me to Mr. Mitchell and have him punish me. When her husband returned home, she immediately entered a list of complaints against me as long as the moral law, including my failure to wash her clothes properly and her inability to break my head for it. The last indictment seemed to be the heaviest she could bring against me. I was in the shadow of the doorway as the woman raved, while Mr. Mitchell listened patiently until the end of his wife's grievances reached an appeal to him to whip me with the strength that a man alone could possess. Then he declared, "Martha, this thing of cutting up and slashing servants is something I know nothing about and positively will not do. I don't believe in slavery anyhow. It is a curse on this land, and I wish we were well rid of it. Mr. Mitchell, I will not have that saucy baggage around this house, for if she finds you won't whip her, there will be no living with her, so you shall just sell her, and I insist upon it." "Well, Martha," he answered, "I found the girl with you when we were married, and as you claim her as yours, I shall not interpose any objections to the disposal of what you choose to call your property in any manner you see fit, and I will make arrangements for selling her at once." I distinctly overheard all that was said, and was just as determined not to be sold as I was not to be whipped. My mother's lawyer had told her to caution me never to go out of the city if, at any time, the white people wanted me to go, so I was quite settled as to my course in case Mr. Mitchell undertook to sell me. Several days after this conversation took place, Mrs. Mitchell, with her baby and nurse, Lucy Wash, made a visit to her grandmother's, leaving orders that I should be sold before her return. So I was not surprised to be ordered by Mr. Mitchell to pack up my clothes and get ready to go down the river, for I was to be sold that morning and leave on the steamboat Alex Scott at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Can't I go see my mother first?" I asked. "No," he replied, not very gently. "There is no time for that. You can see her when you come back. So hurry up and get ready, and let us have no more words about it." How I did hate him. To hear him talk as if I were going to take a pleasure trip, when he knew that if he sold me south as he intended, I would never see my dear mother again. However, I hastily ran upstairs and packed my trunk, but my mother's injunction, never to go out of the city, was ever present in my mind. Mr. Mitchell was superintendent of Indian affairs, his office being in the dwelling house, and I could hear him giving orders to his clerk as I ran lightly down the stairs out of the front door to the street, and with fleet foot I skimmed the road which led to my mother's door, and, reaching it, stood trembling in every limb with terror and fatigue. I could not gain admittance as my mother was away to work and the door was locked. A white woman living next door, and who was always friendly to Mother, told me that she would not return until night. I clasped my hands in despair and cried, "Oh, the white people have sold me, and I had to run away to keep from being sent down the river." This white lady, whose name I am sorry I cannot remember, sympathized with me, as she knew my mother's story and had written many letters for her. So she offered me the key of her house, which fortunately fitted my mother's door, and I was soon inside, cowering with fear in the darkness, magnifying every noise and every passing wind, until my imagination had almost converted the little cottage into a boat, and I was steaming down south, away from my mother as fast as I could go. Late at night, Mother returned and was told all that had happened, and after getting supper, she took me to a friend's house for concealment until the next day. As soon as Mr. Mitchell had discovered my unlooked-for departure, he was furious, for he did not think I had sense enough to run away. He accused the coachman of helping me off, and despite the poor man's denials, hurried him away to the calaboose and put him under the lash in order to force a confession. Finding this course unavailing, he offered a reward to the Negro catchers on the same evening, but their efforts were equally fruitless.